The lawyer's voice echoed through the quiet room as he finished reading the last line of the will. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than ever, marking seconds that felt heavier than stones. Emma sat stiffly on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the wooden table between them. She had prepared herself for disappointment, but nothing could have prepared her for the sound that followed. Margaret laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or an accidental sound. It was sharp, loud, and deliberate, slicing through the silence like a blade. Margaret leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, a satisfied smile stretching across her face. Her pearl necklace rested perfectly against her black dress, not a single sign of grief visible on her flawless appearance. "Nothing," Margaret repeated, shaking her head in disbelief, though her eyes sparkled with triumph. After all these years, she gets absolutely nothing? Emma swallowed hard. The word echoed in her mind. Nothing. She felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Her father's study, once a place of warmth and safety, now felt cold and unfamiliar. The scent of old books and polished wood reminded her of evenings spent here as a child, sitting on the rug while her father read to her by the fireplace. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. As stated, Mr. Whitmore has left the entirety of his estate to his legal spouse, Margaret Whitmore. His daughter, Emma Whitmore, is not listed as a beneficiary of material assets. Margaret smiled wider and turned her gaze toward Emma, her eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "I warned you," she said sweetly. "Your father knew who truly stood by him. Blood doesn't always mean loyalty." Emma said nothing. She felt heat rising behind her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of Margaret. Not now. Not ever again. She had learned long ago that tears only fueled her stepmother's cruelty. When Emma's father married Margaret 10 years ago, Emma had been just 17, still grieving her mother's death. She had hoped Margaret would bring some sense of balance back into their home. Instead, she brought rules, distance, and a constant reminder that Emma was an outsider in her own family. "You should be grateful," Margaret continued, standing up and smoothing her dress. "Your father gave you an education, a roof over your head. That's more than enough." The lawyer gathered his papers quickly, clearly eager to leave. "If there are no further questions, I'll take my leave." Margaret nodded dismissively. "We're done here." Emma waited until the door closed behind the lawyer before she finally stood. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to straighten her shoulders. She looked at Margaret, truly looked at her, and realized something surprising. She felt no anger, only clarity. "I'll pack my things," Emma said quietly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Pack? Oh no, dear. There's no rush. You can stay a few more days. After all, it must be difficult realizing you have nowhere else to go." Emma met her gaze, her voice calm. "I'll manage." Margaret laughed again, softer this time, as if amused by a child's stubbornness. "Of course you will." Emma turned and walked out of the study without another word. Each step up the staircase felt like a goodbye to a piece of her past. Her room was exactly as she had left it. Simple, modest, untouched by Margaret's expensive renovations. She opened her closet and pulled out an old suitcase, one she hadn't used since college. As she packed, memories flooded her mind. Her father teaching her how to ride a bike. Late-night conversations about her dreams. The promise he once made to always protect her. She paused, gripping a folded sweater, wondering how things had gone so wrong. That night, Emma barely slept. The house was eerily quiet, and the shadows seemed longer than usual. Before sunrise, she packed the last of her belongings and left a single note on the desk in her room. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She didn't sign it. As Emma stepped outside, the cold morning air filled her lungs. The estate gates loomed behind her, grand and unwelcoming. She had no inheritance, no safety net, no clear plan. But she had something Margaret underestimated: resilience. She took a deep breath and walked down the long driveway, each step taking her further away from the past and closer to an uncertain future. What Emma didn't know was that her father's will held more secrets than Margaret realized, hidden not in property or money, but in something far more valuable, something that would soon turn Margaret's laughter into regret. The morning sun was barely visible when Emma reached the bus stop at the end of the road. The cold crept through her thin coat, but she welcomed it. It reminded her she was awake, alive, and finally free from the suffocating walls of that house. She sat on the bench, placing her suitcase beside her, and stared at the empty road ahead. For the first time in years, her future was unwritten. The bus arrived with a loud hiss, and Emma climbed aboard, choosing a seat by the window. As the estate disappeared behind rows of trees, she felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Margaret's laughter still echoed in her mind, sharp and humiliating, but Emma refused to let it define her. She headed to the only place she could think of, her childhood town where her Aunt Clara lived. Clara had been her mother's younger sister, quiet but kind, and one of the few people who never treated Emma like a burden. They hadn't spoken much in recent years, mostly because Margaret disliked her and discouraged visits. Still, Emma hoped Clara would understand. When she arrived, the town looked smaller than she remembered. The old bakery on the corner was still there, its windows fogged with warmth. Children ran past with backpacks, laughing, unaware of how fragile life could be. Emma took a deep breath and walked the familiar streets until she reached a modest yellow house with white shutters. Clara opened the door before Emma could knock twice. Her eyes widened in surprise, then softened with concern. "Emma? Oh my goodness, come in, come in." The warmth inside was immediate. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Emma set her suitcase down and suddenly felt the weight of everything she had been holding back. Clara pulled her into a gentle embrace, and for a moment, Emma allowed herself to rest. Later, as they sat at the kitchen table, Emma told her everything. The will, Margaret's laughter, the word nothing. Clara listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. When Emma finished, Clara was silent for a long moment. Then she frowned slightly. "Your father was a careful man," she said slowly. "Too careful to leave you with nothing." Emma shook her head. The lawyer said it clearly. "Everything went to Margaret." "Yes," Clara replied, "but your father trusted people far less than Margaret realized." She stood up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a small, worn envelope. Emma's heart skipped when Clara placed it on the table. "He came to see me 3 months before he died," Clara said. "He told me not to open this unless something like this happened." Emma stared at the envelope. Her name was written on it in her father's handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was a letter. "My dear Emma, if you're reading this, it means things did not go the way I hoped. Please know this first. You were never forgotten, never unloved. Why I left you cannot be taken, laughed at, or stolen. It will test you before it rewards you, but it will give you a life built on truth, not dependence. Trust Clara. Trust yourself. And remember the key." Emma's breath caught. "The key," she whispered. Clara nodded. "He gave me this too." She reached in her pocket and placed a small brass key on the table. It was old, simple, and unfamiliar. "I don't know what it opens," Clara admitted. "But he said you'd know when the time was right." Emma held the key tightly in her palm. A memory stirred. Her father once showing her a storage building near the old train station, telling her some things were too important to keep at home. "I think I know," Emma said. That afternoon, they drove to the edge of town where the abandoned station stood. The building beside it was dusty and forgotten, its paint peeling. Emma's heart pounded as she unlocked the door. Inside were boxes, dozens of them. Files, journals, paintings, and sealed folders neatly labeled. Clara picked one up and opened it, gasping softly. "These are investment records," she said. "Private accounts. Businesses in your name." Emma's hands shook as she opened another box. Inside were letters, years' worth, written by her father, documenting Margaret's manipulation, her financial schemes, and her secret debts. "He knew," Emma whispered. "He knew everything." Clara looked at her with quiet pride. "And he trusted you with the truth." Back at the estate, Margaret stood in front of the mirror, admiring herself in a new silk robe. The house was finally hers. Every painting, every chandelier, every room, hers. She smiled, pouring herself a glass of wine. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered, irritated. Yes. The voice on the other end was calm. Professional. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm calling regarding several accounts frozen under investigation. Margaret's smile vanished. Frozen? That's impossible. I'm afraid it is very possible, the voice continued. We'll need you to come in. The call ended. Margaret stared at her phone, her laughter replaced by unease. For the first time since the will reading, doubt crept in. And far away, Emma stood in the fading sunlight, holding her father's key, realizing that inheriting nothing was only the illusion. Emma barely slept that night. The letter lay folded beside her on the small bedside table in Clara's guest room, and a brass key rested on top of it, catching the faint glow of the lamp. Every time she closed her eyes, her father's words replayed in her mind. Remember the key. Trust yourself. She realized then that her father hadn't left her with nothing at all. He had left her with responsibility. Early the next morning, Clara made coffee while Emma spread the documents across the kitchen table. There were investment summaries, property deeds held under shell companies, and handwritten notes in her father's careful script. He had planned everything meticulously, hiding assets in plain sight, knowing exactly who he needed to protect them from. He was afraid Margaret would destroy everything. Emma said quietly. Clara nodded. Your father saw what she was capable of. He just needed time to make sure you'd be strong enough to handle it. Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. I wish he had trusted me sooner. He did, Clara replied gently. Just not with your safety. They spent hours organizing the papers. Clara helped Emma contact an independent attorney, one her father had once recommended but never publicly worked with. By afternoon, Emma was sitting in a quiet office, explaining everything while the attorney reviewed the documents with growing interest. This is substantial, he said finally. More importantly, it's protected. Your father was very clever. Most of these assets are legally yours, regardless of the will. Emma exhaled slowly, relief washing over her for the first time since the lawyer had spoken that awful word. Nothing. But, the attorney continued, Mrs. Whitmore will not take this quietly. Emma met his gaze. I wouldn't expect her to. Back at the estate, Margaret paced the living room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from the bank. Then another. Each conversation made her more frantic. This must be a mistake, she snapped. I am the legal heir. The bank representative's voice remained firm. Several discrepancies have been flagged, Mrs. Whitmore. Until the investigation is complete, access will remain restricted. Margaret hung up and slammed the phone onto the table. Her reflection in the large mirror looked unfamiliar. Eyes wide, lips tight, confidence cracking. She poured herself another glass of wine, but her hand trembled. This is Emma's doing, she muttered. That ungrateful girl. She thought back to the will reading, to Emma's calm silence. No tears, no anger, just quiet acceptance. At the time, Margaret had thought it was weakness. Now she wasn't so sure. 2 days later, Margaret received a formal letter. Legal language filled the page, but the meaning was clear. Certain assets were being transferred into trusts controlled by Emma Whitmore. Margaret's name appeared nowhere. She let out a bitter laugh, but it sounded hollow. So that's it, she said to the empty room. You thought you could outsmart me from the grave. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Emma stood outside the old estate gates later that afternoon, her heart pounding harder with every step. She hadn't planned to come back so soon, but something inside her told her she needed to face it. Not for revenge, for closure. The gates opened slowly as she pressed the intercom. The familiar driveway stretched ahead, unchanged, but everything felt different now. She was no longer the girl who left with a suitcase and nothing else. Margaret was waiting in the study. You've got some nerve, Margaret said coldly as Emma entered. After everything your father gave you. Emma remained standing, her posture steady. He gave me the truth. Margaret scoffed. You think a few hidden accounts make you powerful? No, Emma replied. They make me free. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. You manipulated this. You turned people against me. I didn't have to, Emma said softly. Your actions did that on their own. For a moment, silence hung between them. Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, her confidence draining away. You always thought you were better than me, she said bitterly. Emma shook her head. I just wanted a place in my own family. Margaret laughed again, but this time there was no triumph in it. Only regret. You'll regret this, she warned. Maybe, Emma said, but not as much as I regret trusting someone who never wanted me here. She turned and walked out, leaving Margaret alone in the study that no longer felt like a throne. That evening, Emma and Clara sat on the porch, watching the sky fade into soft shades of blue and gold. The air felt lighter. What will you do now? Clara asked. Emma smiled faintly. I don't know yet, but for the first time, that doesn't scare me. Somewhere across town, Margaret stared at the walls of the estate, realizing that everything she thought she owned was slipping through her fingers. The laughter she once used to humiliate had turned against her, and Emma, who had inherited nothing, was finally beginning to understand the true weight of what she had been given. The weeks that followed moved quietly, but beneath the calm, everything was changing. Emma settled into a small routine at Clara's house, waking early, reviewing documents, making careful decisions. Each signature felt heavy, not because of fear, but because she understood now that every choice carried consequences. This wasn't just about money. It was about rebuilding something that had been slowly taken from her for years, her sense of worth. The attorney called one morning with an update. The investigation into Mrs. Whitmore's financial activities is expanding, he said. Several transactions were traced back to accounts she attempted to conceal. Emma closed her eyes briefly. She felt no satisfaction, only a quiet sadness. What happens now? She'll likely face legal action, he replied. And she knows you're the reason this came to light. Emma thanked him and ended the call. Clara watched her carefully. You don't look relieved, she said. I didn't want her punished, Emma replied. I just wanted the truth. The truth has a way of punishing people on its own, Clara said gently. That afternoon, Emma returned to the storage building near the old train station. There were still boxes she hadn't opened. One in particular caught her attention, smaller than the rest, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal. Her father's handwriting filled every page. He wrote about his regrets, about marrying too soon after Emma's mother's death, about ignoring warning signs because he wanted peace. Most of all, he wrote about Emma, her strength, her kindness, and his fear that Margaret would crush her spirit if he wasn't careful. Tears blurred Emma's vision as she turned the pages. For the first time, she felt truly seen. That evening, Margaret sat alone at the long dining table in the estate, the silence pressing in from every side. The staff had been dismissed, the accounts frozen. The house felt enormous and empty. A knock echoed through the hall. Margaret stiffened. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, a man in a dark coat stood there, holding a folder. Mrs. Whitmore? I'm here on behalf of the Financial Crimes Unit. Her face drained of color. This is a mistake. Perhaps, he said calmly, but we'll need to ask you a few questions. As the door closed behind them, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, fear. Days later, Emma received a message. Margaret wanted to meet. No lawyers, no accusations, just a conversation. Clara looked worried. You don't owe her anything. I know, Emma said, but I owe myself closure. They met at a quiet cafe halfway between town and the estate. Margaret arrived late, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. She looked thinner, older. When she sat down, she removed the glasses, revealing tired eyes. You look well, Margaret said stiffly. Emma nodded. So do you. They sat in silence for a moment, the clinking of cups filling the space between them. I never meant for it to go this far, Margaret said finally. Emma studied her face. Then why did you laugh? Margaret flinched. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid that if I didn't assert control, I'd lose everything. You already had everything, Emma said quietly. You just couldn't share it. Margaret's lips trembled. Your father loved you. I knew that, and I hated you for it. The honesty surprised Emma. She felt anger rise, then fade. I didn't want to replace anyone, she said. I just wanted to belong. Margaret looked down at her hands. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not here to give it, Emma replied. I'm here to let go. They stood, an unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't reconciliation. It was an ending. As Emma walked away, she felt lighter than she had in years. That night, Emma sat by the window, the journal open on her lap. She realized something important. Her inheritance wasn't hidden accounts or properties. It was the freedom to choose a life that reflected who she truly was. Spring arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, but Emma felt the shift inside her before she saw it outside. The heaviness that once followed her like a shadow had begun to lift. Mornings no longer started with anxiety, but with intention. She woke early, walked through the town while the streets were still empty, and allowed herself to breathe without fear of being watched or judged. The attorney finalized the legal structures her father had put in place. Trusts were activated, businesses transferred, and protections reinforced. Emma signed each document carefully, not rushing, not overwhelmed. Power felt different than she had imagined. It wasn't loud or sharp like Margaret's dominance. It was quiet, steady, and rooted in choice. One afternoon, Clara watched her from across the kitchen table and smiled. You're different, she said. Emma looked up. How? Stronger, Clara replied. But softer too, like you finally trust yourself. Emma thought about that long after Clara left the room. Trusting herself had once felt impossible. Every decision she made in the past had been questioned, corrected, or mocked. Now the silence around her decisions felt strange but freeing. She decided to visit one of the smaller businesses her father had invested in years ago, a struggling bookstore near the edge of town. The owner, a gray-haired man named Thomas, looked shocked when she introduced herself. Your father used to come here, he said, eyes brightening with memory. He believed this place mattered. Emma walked between the shelves, running her fingers over worn spines, feeling something settle inside her. I believe that too, she said. She chose not to change much. She didn't rebrand or modernize aggressively. Instead, she listened. To Thomas. To customers. To the quiet heartbeat of the place. Slowly, the bookstore began to thrive again, not because of money, but because of care. News traveled faster than Emma expected. Margaret's situation worsened. The investigation uncovered more than hidden accounts. There were forged signatures, diverted funds, and quiet betrayals that stretched back years. Friends who once filled the estate with laughter stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. Doors closed. Margaret sat alone in the grand house, now stripped of warmth and illusion. The silence mocked her. She replayed that moment in the study again and again. Emma standing calm, unreadable, not broken, not defeated. How did I miss it? Margaret whispered to herself. The truth was painful. She hadn't missed it. She had ignored it. She had mistaken Emma's quiet endurance for weakness and never considered that stillness could hide strength. One evening, a letter arrived at Claire's house. Emma recognized the handwriting immediately. She opened it slowly. Emma, I don't know if you'll read this, but I need to write it. Everything I built was based on fear. Fear of losing, fear of being replaced, fear of being alone. I thought control would save me. It didn't. I don't ask for forgiveness. I only ask that you live the life I was too afraid to live honestly. Margaret. Emma folded the letter and placed it in the drawer without comment. She felt no triumph, only a quiet understanding of how easily fear could destroy a person if left unchecked. Months passed. Emma moved into a small house of her own near the edge of town. It wasn't grand, but it was bright, filled with sunlight and simple furniture she chose herself. Each object held intention. Nothing was there to impress anyone. She started a foundation in her father's name, supporting young women who had lost family support too early. She didn't make speeches or seek attention. She simply showed up, listened, and offered opportunities. One evening, while organizing files, Emma found a final note tucked into the back of her father's journal. You were never meant to inherit my life, only the courage to build your own. Emma closed the journal, tears finally falling freely, not from pain but from gratitude. Far away, Margaret packed her belongings into boxes under the watchful eye of legal representatives. The estate was no longer hers. She moved into a small apartment, stripped of luxury, surrounded by the consequences of her choices. Late at night, she sometimes laughed softly to herself, bitter and hollow, remembering the sound she once used to humiliate a girl she believed had inherited nothing. She had been wrong. Emma stood on her porch one evening, watching the sunset stretch across the sky. The future no longer felt like an empty space to fear. It felt like an open path. She smiled, not because she had won, but because she had survived, grown, and chosen herself. And in that choice, she realized something simple and powerful. The greatest inheritance was never money. It was freedom. Time moved forward in a way Emma had never experienced before, without dread. Days no longer blurred into something she simply endured. Each morning carried a quiet purpose, and each night ended with a sense of completion rather than exhaustion. She began to understand that healing was not a sudden moment, but a series of small, deliberate choices. The foundation grew steadily. Women from different towns began reaching out, sharing stories that mirrored Emma's own in painful ways. Some had lost parents too young. Others had been pushed aside by families who chose control over compassion. Emma listened to every story personally at first, even when Clara worried it was too much. "It helps me remember why I started," Emma said. One afternoon, a young woman named Lily sat across from her in the small office Emma had set up above the bookstore. Lily's hands shook as she spoke about being cut off from her family after refusing an arranged marriage. "I was told I'd regret choosing nothing," Lily said softly. The word struck Emma like an echo from the past. "You didn't choose nothing," Emma replied gently. "You chose yourself." Lily's eyes filled with tears, and in that moment Emma understood something profound. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was becoming a bridge for others. Meanwhile, the final legal proceedings against Margaret concluded quietly. There were no dramatic headlines, no public spectacle, just courtrooms, documents, and consequences. Margaret avoided publicity, keeping her head down, her former confidence replaced with caution. One evening, as Emma locked up the bookstore, she noticed someone standing across the street. The figure hesitated, then slowly stepped forward. It was Margaret. She looked smaller than Emma remembered, not physically but in presence. Gone were the sharp posture and commanding gaze. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, uncertain. "I won't stay long," Margaret said before Emma could speak. Emma nodded. "You could talk." Margaret glanced at the bookstore window. "Your father would have liked this," she said quietly. "You always loved places like this." Emma said nothing, waiting. "I used to think strength meant never bending," Margaret continued, "never admitting fault. I was wrong." Emma felt no urge to argue. "I lost everything I thought defined me," Margaret said, her voice tight. "And for a long time, I blamed you." Emma met her eyes calmly. "And now? And now I know it wasn't you," Margaret admitted. "It was the fear I refused to face." Silence settled between them. Not heavy, not tense, just honest. "I don't expect forgiveness," Margaret said again, almost repeating her letter. "I just needed to say this out loud." Emma considered her carefully. "Acknowledging the truth matters," she said. "But so does what you do with it." Margaret nodded. "I know." She turned to leave, then paused. "I laughed because I thought I'd won," she said. "But you walked away, and I stayed behind with everything empty. That was when I lost." Emma watched her go, feeling neither victory nor pity, only closure. That night, Emma dreamed of her father for the first time in months. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside her, watching as she helped someone up a steep hill. When she woke, she felt peaceful. Opportunities continued to appear, but Emma learned to choose carefully. She declined partnerships that felt rushed or misaligned. She invested in people rather than promises. Slowly, her influence grew, not as a figure of power, but as a presence of stability. Clara visited less often now, not because they'd grown apart, but because Emma had built a life that stood on its own. Still, they spoke every week, sharing quiet laughter and small updates. One evening, Clara asked, "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Emma thought for a long moment. Sometimes, she admitted, but if they had been, I might never have learned who I am. Winter came gently. Snow dusted the rooftops and softened the edges of the town. Emma hosted a small gathering at the bookstore. Tea, books, and stories. Nothing extravagant, just warmth. As she looked around the room, filled with people who felt safe, who felt seen, Emma realized something else. She was no longer surviving her past. She was living beyond it. Far away, in a modest apartment, Margaret sat by a small window, watching the same snowfall. She held a cup of tea, her hands steady now. For the first time, she wasn't running from silence. She was sitting with it, learning what it revealed. She thought of Emma, not with resentment, but with something closer to respect. The laughter that once defined her power no longer lived in her voice. It had been replaced by reflection. And Emma, standing beneath soft lights and quiet joy, understood at last that inheriting nothing had been the beginning of everything. The new year arrived without ceremony, but Emma felt its presence in the stillness of the mornings and the way the light lingered longer in the afternoons. She had learned to recognize change not by noise, but by subtle shifts, the easing of tension in her shoulders, the quiet confidence with which she made decisions, the absence of fear when her phone rang with unknown numbers. The foundation expanded beyond what she had first imagined. Requests came not just for financial support, but for guidance. Emma resisted becoming a symbol or a savior. Instead, she created mentorship circles, small and intentional, where women could speak without interruption and be heard without judgment. She sat among them, not above them, sharing parts of her story only when it served a purpose. One afternoon, while reviewing applications, Emma noticed a familiar pattern. Many of the women described moments when they had been dismissed, laughed at, or told they were foolish for choosing independence over comfort. The words changed, but the message was always the same. You are nothing without us. Emma closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, feeling a familiar ache, but this time, it didn't weaken her. It sharpened her resolve. She decided to host a small conference, not in a grand hall, but in the town's community center. No press, no donors on display, just conversation. When she stood in front of the room, she didn't prepare a speech. She spoke simply. I was told I inherited nothing, she said. But nothing turned out to be space. Space to build something honest. The room was silent, attentive. Don't confuse being underestimated with being unprepared, she continued. Sometimes people laugh because they don't understand the strength it takes to walk away. She stepped down to sit among them again, the words settling quietly into the room. That evening, Emma walked home under a sky heavy with stars. She felt grounded, present. For the first time, she wasn't running toward a future or away from a past. She was standing exactly where she belonged. Across town, Margaret watched the same sky from her apartment window. Her life had become smaller, but not emptier. She volunteered twice a week at a local shelter, sorting donations, serving meals, doing work that required no performance. At first, it had felt like punishment. Now it felt like penance and, perhaps slowly, growth. One night, a woman at the shelter recognized her name. The recognition passed without comment, without judgment. Margaret realized then how fragile reputation was, and how little it meant without integrity behind it. She thought often of Emma, not with envy, but with clarity. She saw now that Emma's power had never come from inheritance. It came from restraint, from knowing when to speak and when to walk away. Months later, Emma received an invitation to speak at a regional forum on ethical leadership. She almost declined. The room would be full of titles and expectations. But Clara encouraged her gently. Your voice belongs there, she said, not because of who you are, but because of what you've learned. Emma agreed on one condition: no introduction listing achievements. Just her name. When she stood at the podium, she felt no nerves, only responsibility. We often measure success by what we accumulate, she said. But the truest measure is what we refuse to become in order to get it. The applause that followed was respectful, not thunderous. She preferred it that way. Afterward, a young man approached her. My mother went through something similar, he said. She was told she'd regret choosing independence. She didn't. Emma smiled. Neither will you. That night, she returned home and opened her father's journal again. She read passages she had skipped before, notes about restraint, about letting people reveal themselves over time, about patience being a form of strength. She realized then that her father hadn't just protected assets. He had protected her from becoming bitter. Spring returned, softer than before. The bookstore hosted readings, quiet gatherings, moments of shared humanity. Emma watched connections form, friendships, collaborations, healing. One afternoon, Lily returned, smiling brighter than Emma had ever seen her. I've started my own business, she said. It's small, but it's mine. Emma hugged her without hesitation. That's how it begins. Far from the town's quiet rhythm, Margaret received a letter, an offer to speak privately with a counselor as part of a restorative program. She accepted, not because she was required to, but because she was ready. In her sessions, she spoke about fear, about control, about laughter used as armor. She spoke Emma's name without anger, only acknowledgement. I thought breaking her would make me safe, Margaret said once, but only made me smaller. The counselor nodded. And now I'm learning how to live without needing to win, Margaret replied. Time continued, steady and unremarkable, which Emma had come to appreciate. She understood now that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment. On a quiet evening, Emma stood in her garden, hands in the soil, planting something new. The air smelled of earth and possibility. She paused, looking at the horizon, thinking of how far she had come from that moment in the study when laughter filled the room. She smiled, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in gratitude, because being told she had nothing had given her everything she needed to build a life that no one could take away. And the story was not ending. It was simply continuing exactly as it should. The following months unfolded with a gentle steadiness that Emma had once believed was impossible. Life no longer rushed at her in sharp turns or sudden losses. Instead, it moved like a calm river, sometimes deep, sometimes slow, but always forward. She learned that growth did not need an audience, and that meaning often arrived quietly. Emma spent more time listening than speaking. At the bookstore, she would sit near the back during readings, watching people connect through shared stories. She noticed how strangers lingered longer now, how conversations stretched beyond pages and titles. The space had become more than a business. It was a refuge, and without realizing it, so had she. One afternoon, Emma received a message from an unfamiliar name. It was from a woman who had attended the community conference months earlier. The message was simple. I didn't think anyone would understand, but you did. Thank you for reminding me that silence can also be strength. Emma read it twice, then set the phone down, feeling the weight of responsibility and gratitude settle together. She had once feared visibility, but now she understood it was not about being seen. It was about being present when it mattered. Clara visited that weekend, carrying a basket of baked bread and familiar warmth. They sat on the porch, watching the afternoon fade into evening. You've built something rare, Clara said softly. Emma shook her head. I didn't build it alone. That's exactly why it works, Clara replied. They talked about small things, weather, books, neighbors, but beneath it all was an unspoken understanding. Emma no longer needed reassurance. She had found her footing. Elsewhere, Margaret's life continued in quieter tones. She no longer avoided mirrors, though she no longer lingered in front of them either. She attended counseling regularly, not because she was ordered to, but because she had learned how dangerous unexamined fear could be. At the shelter, she worked alongside people who knew nothing of her past. She served meals, folded clothes, listened to stories that humbled her. Some nights, she went home exhausted but lighter, realizing how much effort she had once spent maintaining an image instead of a conscience. One evening, a woman at the shelter asked her, "What did you do before this?" Margaret paused. "I spent a lot of time trying to control things," she said honestly. The woman nodded. "That'll tire anyone out." Margaret smiled faintly. It was the truest conversation she'd had in years. Back in town, Emma faced a choice. An offer had come in, an opportunity to expand the foundation nationally. More funding, more reach, more attention. The proposal sat unopened on her desk for days. Finally, she called Lily. "What would you do?" Emma asked. Lily laughed softly. "I'd ask myself if growth means impact or distraction." That night, Emma reread her father's journal. One line stood out more clearly than ever before. Not every open door leads forward. Some exist only to test your clarity. She declined the offer politely. The decision brought immediate peace. Emma chose depth over scale, connection over recognition. She trusted that what was meant to grow would do so organically. Spring turned to summer. The garden behind her house flourished, each plant a quiet reflection of patience and care. Emma spent mornings there before work, hands in soil, thoughts unhurried. She found that tending to something living grounded her more than any strategy meeting ever could. One afternoon, as she watered the plants, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. She considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered. "Emma," came a hesitant voice. "It's Margaret." Emma closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. "Yes, I won't take much of your time," Margaret said. "I just wanted you to know I'm leaving town." Emma said nothing, listening. "I've been offered a position with a nonprofit in another city," Margaret continued. "It's small and anonymous. That feels right. I hope it brings you peace," Emma said honestly. Margaret hesitated. "It already has, in ways I didn't expect." There was a pause. Then, quietly, "It didn't destroy me. You showed me who I was becoming." That mattered. Emma let the words settle. "Goodbye, Margaret." "Goodbye, Emma." When the call ended, Emma felt no surge of emotion. Just closure, complete and gentle. That evening, Emma walked through the town as lights flickered on one by one. She passed the cafe where she and Margaret had once sat across from each other, the moment that marked an ending. She passed the community center, now alive with laughter and voices. She passed the bookstore, glowing warmly against the dusk. She realized then that her life no longer revolved around what had been taken or denied. It revolved around what she chose to nurture. Later that night, Emma received a handwritten letter delivered to her mailbox. The envelope bore no return address. Inside was a simple note. "You were right. Nothing was never the end. It was the beginning of learning how to live honestly. Thank you for not becoming what hurt you." Emma folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her father's journal. As summer deepened, Emma hosted a small gathering in her garden. No speeches, no agenda, just people who had found one another through shared courage. They talked, laughed, sat in comfortable silence. Children ran barefoot through the grass. Someone played music softly in the background. Emma watched it all with a quiet smile. She thought back to the sound of laughter in the study, the kind that was meant to diminish, to claim victory. How strange it seemed now. How powerless it felt compared to the quiet strength surrounding her. As the evening drew to a close, Emma stood alone for a moment beneath the stars. She felt complete, not because she had resolved every pain, but because she no longer needed to. She understood now that some inheritances arrive disguised as loss. Some gifts only reveal themselves when everything familiar is stripped away. Emma breathed deeply, grounded and unafraid. There was still one part of her journey left to tell, and she was ready for it. The morning Emma woke before the sun on the final day of summer, she felt an unfamiliar sense of stillness. Not emptiness, but completion. The kind that settles when something has fully come into its own. She lay quietly for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of the town waking up, and realized she was no longer waiting for the next chapter to begin. She was already living inside it. She rose, dressed simply, and stepped outside. The garden glistened with dew, leaves heavy with growth that had taken months of care. Emma walked slowly among the plants, brushing her fingers against them, remembering how fragile they had once looked when first planted. She understood now that nothing truly strong begins fully formed. Everything meaningful starts small, uncertain, and exposed. At the bookstore later that morning, Emma found a note taped to the counter. It was from Thomas. "Gone fishing. Back tomorrow." Thank you for trusting this place with patience. Emma smiled and placed the note carefully in a drawer she reserved for things that mattered. Over time, she had learned which moments deserved preservation and which were meant to pass freely. She spent the afternoon organizing letters the foundation had received. Some were updates, some were thank yous. One, written in careful handwriting, stood out. I was told once that walking away meant losing everything. But I walked anyway. I'm scared, but I'm free. I don't know what comes next. I just know I didn't inherit nothing after all. Emma folded the letter slowly, feeling the familiar echo of her own past, but now without pain. Only recognition. That evening, Clara arrived unannounced, carrying a small wooden box. I found this while cleaning, she said. Your father left it with me years ago. He said you'd know when it was time. Emma opened the box. Inside was a single photograph. Her and her father sitting on the floor of the old study, surrounded by books. They were laughing, truly laughing. No fear, no tension, just warmth. Beneath, it was a note in his handwriting. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone who refuses to see it. If they laugh, let them. Laughter fades. Integrity doesn't. Emma closed the box, holding it to her chest. For the first time, she felt the full circle of his protection, not through control, but through trust. As night fell, Emma hosted one final gathering of the season in her garden. No announcements, no purpose beyond being together. Lily arrived first, then others, faces that had once carried uncertainty, now softened by belonging. Someone asked Emma quietly, "Do you ever think about how close you came to losing everything?" Emma considered the question honestly. "I think about how close I came to believing I had nothing," she replied. "That would have been the real loss." Laughter drifted through the air, gentle, genuine, unguarded. The kind that didn't wound or dominate. The kind that healed. Far away, in a different city, Margaret stood in a modest office, unpacking a small box onto a plain desk. No nameplate, no recognition, just work that mattered quietly. She paused, looking out the window, and allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in her life, she wasn't measuring herself against anyone else. She thought of Emma, not as the girl she once dismissed, but as the woman who had walked away without bitterness. Margaret understood now that true power was never about winning. It was about choosing not to harm. Back in the garden, the evening wound down. One by one, guests said their goodbyes, leaving behind warmth rather than absence. Emma stood alone once more beneath the stars, the same stars that had watched her walk away from the estate with a suitcase and uncertainty. She thought of that moment. Margaret's laughter, the word nothing spoken like a verdict. How strange it felt now. Nothing had been the clearing, the open ground, the beginning. Emma looked around at the life she had built. Not flashy, not loud, but deeply rooted. A life shaped by choice rather than fear, by purpose rather than resentment. She whispered softly into the night, not as a promise, but as a truth. I inherited exactly what I needed. The wind moved gently through the garden, carrying the scent of earth and possibility. Emma turned toward her home, unburdened, complete, and ready, not for a new beginning, but for a continued becoming. And somewhere beyond loss and laughter, the story finally rested, not with triumph, not with revenge, but with peace.